Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Brad Cruz. I am the Associate Vice President of Alumni Relations at Case Western Reserve University, as you can see from my shirt today. It's great to have all of you here. I'm actually going to ask all of us, if you get a chance, to put your location in the chat. So I am doing that right now. And here's also, so this is our first ever meeting of our page turners group. We're thrilled to have this group. So what we're going to do is our host and our guest are going to talk for a little while, and then we're actually going to go to questions. So if you will use your icon to raise your hand, I will call on you. One of our folks working with me, my colleagues Summer Cantor, Katie O'Malley, Davey Barris. One of us will then, will unmute you. You can ask your question, and then our host and our guest will talk with you. So, with that said, we ask for your grace. This is our first time. We're going to ask for your feedback, your constructive feedback, after this is over. But I'm going to mute myself now, and I'm going to turn this over to Karen Kaler. One more thing I would say is this is all done in anticipation for the Billy Collins Think Forum event, which will happen on Tuesday, December 3rd. With that said, Karen Kaler, you have the screen, the floor, whatever. Take it away.
Hello, welcome everyone. We are so glad you are here for our first ever, as Brad said. Now, whether or not this is one and done or a continuing concern really depends on you. We want feedback. We want this to help you really appreciate our wonderful Think Forum. It's December 3rd with Billy Collins, having it in advance. It's sort of like if you go to this wonderful book group that then you get to have the author come for your second meeting. That's the plan. You need to tell us if you think it worked. If it didn't, we won't do it again. If it did, tell us things that can make it even better. Now, for our very first one, we advertised that Lindsay Turner would be with us. Here is a book of poems that she published, but Lindsay's not here, but she is here in spirit. She had a family emergency. She's one of the poets on faculty, and she and Walt Hunter, who is the chair of the English department, have recommended that we have Ryan here. And Ryan is going to introduce himself and tell him, because he is an expert and I am not. So Ryan.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Mrs. Kaler. I'm not a great replacement for Lindsay Turner, but I'm very happy to be here. I'm a PhD in the English department. I study poetry and poetics. My research is mainly on the ontology of poetry. So what makes poems poetic, and how does that help us talk about them and find value in them?
What does make poems poetic? I mean, somebody asked that. I was at a talk with Walt Hunter, and somebody said, well, why is this a poem? Mm-hmm. So what?
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting approaches. The one that's always been most convincing to me comes from the great late critic and poet John Hollander, who says that poems trope their own schemes, which is a fancy way of saying that the formal materials of poetry are essential to the kinds of representation that poems do. They're not arbitrary, but they're necessary. And I think we'll actually get to see some of this working in some of Billy Collins' poems.
Oh, well, that's true. So as we said, Billy Collins will be here December 3rd, and we're going to start with Introduction to Poetry. We sent you a few. You didn't have to do your homework. We thought it might, if you wanted to read ahead. To me, I like with poetry, it settles in, right? In fact, let me just tell you something Billy Collins said about it settling in. Oh, if I can find it. He does, well, I'm going to have to memorize it. Musical Tables is a cute book he did. Cute is that a proper word for?
It's perfect.
It's short poems. They're all short and to the point. And one is titled Page Turner, a lovely thing in a novel, not what you want in a short book of poems. So I like to let poems settle. You don't want to just flip through and read them fast, right? So you had a chance to let this settle. So Introduction to Poetry.
Yeah, for sure. Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means.
Isn't that great? Billy Collins was on taught creative writing in the summer program at Stony Brook, and that's where my husband and I got to meet him. He and Frank McCourt of Angela's Ashes fame, they were buddies. I mean, all these, to just see and meet these people was fascinating. But he was a teacher, so you can tell he's talking about teaching poetry and what students, what's going to be on the exam rather than just living with it. Here's another one of his short ones about creative writing that also shows he's an actual teacher. When I told a student not to use single quotation marks around lines of dialogue, he told me that all words are already inside the quotation marks that God placed around creation.
That's wonderful.
Isn't that fun? The thing that I love too about Introduction to Poetry, the press an ear against its hive. I kept bees for a while, and I love bees. And you have to really hear them. And when you listen, if something is wrong with the queen, they have a different sound, a hollow sound, and you can hear it just by being present and listening. So the pressing the ear against the hive, I love that image. And what speaks to you in this one?
Yeah, it's wonderful. I'm interested in the way some of these images hold together. So holding it up to the light like a color slide, or pressing an ear against the hive, or putting a mouse in it to probe its way out. Seeing, hearing, observing how things respond to it. Almost like a kind of scientific analysis that we perform on poems, But then it gets to other things. I want them to water ski across it. This is just pure enjoyment rather than analysis, right? And so I think the way that these hold together is the various things that you can do with poetry, rather than just try to torture a confession out of it to figure out what it really means, right? These are the things that Billy Collins wants poetry to be able to do for you, right? Beyond, or there's an old quote, a poem should not mean but be, and I think that that's kind of his concern here in this poem, right? And then beyond that, there's some more interesting things, some ironies, we might say. So we are like ourselves in observing what these things really mean, how they hold together. Does that leave us squeezing meaning out of the poem rather than just doing what he wants us to do, right? The fact that we're sitting here talking about it seems to kind of, are we guilty of doing the very thing that his students do in torturing confessions out of poems, right? There's a little wink and a nod to us right there in that.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I think this poem doesn't just make a claim, but it kind of acts out the claim that it's making. If it's asking us what it means to read poetry, it doesn't just want to tell us how to read poetry. It wants us to think the kind of wandering through images, the moments of just enjoyment where, does water skiing have anything to do with all these scientific observations? Maybe not, but it just doesn't have to.
Yeah. One of my favorite novelists is Toni Morrison. I just love her work. And I remember somebody telling me once that they had trouble because they couldn't understand what she was doing all the time. And I think her writing was very poetic prose, and just beautiful words. But what I told this person who said, I just can't understand, is like, you don't have to understand everything, just experience and just keep going. And
Yeah, I think that's great. And Billy Collins, of course, is oftentimes seen as a predecessor in a way to someone like Robert Frost, right? So we could think about Robert Frost in the modernist milieu, where there's all these high modernists like Wallace Stevens or Marianne Moore. They're very avant-garde. They're more interested in creating an audience rather than writing to an audience. Whereas Robert Frost, Robert Frost is sometimes worried that that corners off poetry, right? He wants everybody to have a certain accessibility to poetry. And we can see Billy Collins working in that tradition of poets like Longfellow or Frost in some of these great poems.
Yeah, well, I think that's why I enjoy Collins, is because I really do find him very accessible. And I think we're ready to see what you out there, what do you think?
Okay, so if you will raise your hand if you'd like a question and make a statement, I will call on you, and then someone will unmute you. And so if you can use your icon, and I'm gonna scan my. All right. Wow, and crickets.
Okay.
Nobody.
Oh, okay, should we move to the next poem?
Moves to the next poem, or do you have and Karen and I are not in the same room right now. Do you have like an open-ended question you would like to throw to the group, and maybe we get responses that way?
Okay, let me just, while you're thinking about it, I'm going to read you another really short poem. It's titled Carbon Dating. He tried it once as a last resort, but most of the women were a million years old. Any comments?
I got it. I got that one. All right. Can I ask Ryan a question? So, Ryan, I would just like to know, like, how did you become like an aficionado or an expert or any along those lines of Billy Collins? Like, what led you to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Billy Collins is going to be one of the poets you'll actually find on the bookshelves of most bookstores, right? And so I found him that way at first and read it, and I thought, this is enjoyable. And as I've gone back to his poetry, I can start to see the ways in which it's invested in poetic history. And I think some of our, this poem that we just read, it's kind of a product of what we might call the new criticism, which is this movement in that kind of brought about the creation of English departments in universities, right? Before, say, I don't know, the 1920s, you didn't have students sit around and analyze poetry and talk about what it meant, right? And so the kind of advent of interpretation is kind of what this poem is about, right? That you can have students find meaning in poetry, but sometimes we do this to the exclusion of the other things that poetry offers, the enjoyment that it offers, or all the different things that you can do with it, right?
Okay, if nobody has asked a question, I'm going to read you the lanyard. Oh, we have a question.
Question from Fern.
Oh, go. I didn't see that. Go. Way to go, Katie. Thanks.
Hello. I think that a lot of modern readers just don't have the patience to sit with a poem. Sometimes when you read a poem and you don't understand what it means, it's okay, because the meaning will unfold for you, or maybe it never does, but you still just to enjoy the poem. But one of the things I really like about poets like Billy Collins is that they come up with the most unusual things to write poems about, and you think, I never thought about that. And that's an interesting thing to have written a poem about. Who would think to do that? And so I find that very interesting about poets. And plus, as I mentioned about not sitting with a poem, it's also really interesting to go back to books of poets and reread poems, because they may mean things to you at later times that they hadn't on your first reading. So as you kind of get to know a poem, it's like, oh yeah, there's my old friend. We're back again with this poem. And then maybe it'll bring out some more meaning to you that it didn't before.
Thank you, Fern. Thank you so much. And I have a question that came in as a direct message to me. So I'm going to ask it for this person. And the question is, can you tell us about Billy Collins' background? And this person thinks his poems are very, very meaningful.
Do you know what? I don't. Do you know about his early background?
I don't know a ton about his background, no. I know his first book of poetry. I know about the history of his work, I could say. So he started publishing, I think, in the late 1970s with smaller presses. He had a few books with smaller presses, and then he was with, interestingly, the University of Pittsburgh Press for a little bit before he moved on to Random House. And so even this popular poet that we think about that's widely accessible in every bookstore started out in more niche venues, I guess you might say, with these smaller presses, even academic presses, before kind of growing that wider readership, the same way we might have seen with someone like Robert Frost, who started out publishing in modernist little magazines, was friends with Ezra Pound and those sorts of modernists before he started to grow a kind of national reputation. So that's something that's interesting about Collins' kind of progress, and how do you become a national poetic figure? It's something that we don't have the way that we might have in the 19th century.
Yeah. Well, and something that I noticed in his works that I never really thought about before, where he'll have like new and selected poems. There's several of the books that say new and selected poems. So this one, Sailing Around the Room, has poems beginning from 1988. And then, so there will be several of the older from other collections, and then the more new work.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, great.
So here's something I just found from Wikipedia, is that Billy Collins is an only child. Did you guys know that?
Nope.
I did not.
No, I know, and I think that's interesting. So Gail has a question. What do you think made Billy Collins to be selected as poet laureate compared to other poets?
Oh,
and Dina, we'll come to you. I'm sorry.
That's an expert question, right?
Yeah, it's. I don't know exactly the process of how they choose poet laureates. There's a number of various awards, poetry awards nationwide. He was publishing in some of the top venues, places like Poetry Magazine, which is still quite influential. The New Yorker. So he was publishing in the top magazines and really gained a wide readership and was much beloved. And I think that that's part of what you look for in a poet laureate, is not just who's intellectually the most interesting poet, but who's the poet that can engage the heart of an entire nation.
Yeah.
And that's certainly Billy Collins.
Yeah.
All right. So I just want to let you know that Dina has commented, and she just said some of her favorite poems, and I don't know if Karen and Ryan, if you could speak to any of these, but hers are View. They're from musical tables. View, The Visit, Divorce, View from a Bridge, and 3 a.m. Do any of those poems speak to the two of you? Or I know it's kind of like just kind of like very, very, very sporadic and kind of random to the two of you. So.
Would she like to read one of those for the group?
Dina's raised her hand, so let's Davey or Summer, can you guys spot Dina, and then I'll be quiet. We'll let Dina hear from her own words.
Thank you. I'm grateful to be here. I'll just do, and I sent the page numbers too, in case that's helpful.
She did.
But 3 a.m. on page 110. Only my hand is asleep, but it's a start.
I actually love that. I love that.
And so there are a bunch of them that are just, I think, really fun. So if it's okay to do another.
Absolutely.
View from a bridge. I never thought of myself as a little universe inside a big one until just now. And so you mentioned before how poems can kind of sit with you. And this is one that has been sitting with me for a little bit. I mean, some of the others have too, but there's just there's something accessible about the short poems that he writes or the way he writes that makes me feel like I could write a poem too.
Yeah, and if I might say something on these short poems, he's playing with a certain tradition in poetry that we would call the epigram, that goes all the way back to the Roman poets. They're supposed to be quick and witty and memorable, something that you might be able to make a part of your everyday life. Oftentimes, epigrams could have been kind of biting and satiric, but we see with Billy Collins him going a different direction with the epigram tradition of how can I see moments anew in everyday life in a more, well, I don't know, he's an optimistic poet. There's not a lot of optimistic poets sometimes, but he's certainly one, and we can see him doing that with his short poems.
Yeah. And I see a physical hand up. Someone in a beautiful library, but I can't see your name. But can you raise your hand again?
I'm looking for a hand.
I
Oh, there you go. Carl.
finally
Cal.
registered.
Welcome, Cal.
Hi there. What I like about Collins is the way so many of his poems run along rather lightly on the surface, and then when he's got you fooled, they dive so deeply. And a great example of that is Dharma, which is, it's a 4-stanza poem, but he's describing his dog. And off she goes into the material world with nothing but her brown coat and her modest blue collar. He draws a parallel with Thoreau and with Gandhi. And then the last stanza is, if only she did not shove the cat aside every morning and eat all his food. What a model of self-containment she would be. What a paragon of earthly detachment. If only she were so eager, not so eager for a rub behind the ears, so acrobatic in her welcomes. If only I were not her God.
That's a hook. That's a hook.
That certainly is.
It's the essence of a dog. It's so lovely.
Yeah, and these what's really interesting to me about his use of the everyday, and we can see one of those in something like the lanyard here in a moment too, is it's not just about well, there's this great old essay from 1917 titled Art as Technique by Victor Shklovsky. And in it he says, what makes something, this is another way of thinking about what makes something poetic. He says it's not about images or creating new images. These are all the same old images that we're already familiar with. But it's how can a poet defamiliarize things? How can see something anew for the first time? And that's what Billy Collins, I think, does with his use of these everyday things that we're always encountering. But how can I see this anew? How can it defamiliarize my experience of the world?
Yeah. You know what? I think that with visual art as well, I was an art major, and what makes it art is you see things in a new way, and poetry does the same. Yeah. Okay.
I have a question from Barb. So Barb, we're going to unmute you, and you've got the floor, or the screen, I guess I should say. And I just lost Barb.
Unmuting. There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, it's been a couple of years since I did Zoom. I retired, and I don't even care. Well, I want to answer the question about what do you think made him a good candidate for
J.R., please.
The poet laureate. And I think one thing is accessibility. I realized I joined this because I'm a poet fan, and I realized all of the poetry I've been reading defined as modern was Walt Whitman onward. And I hadn't really read anybody from 2000. All of the books I saw in my library were older, less modern poets. So when I picked this up, the thing to think about is he doesn't actually disorient me. What he does is he orients me down a path that is so visual and so the imagery is so rich. I'm following every single way, and he ends up in an unexpected place, but I don't feel like it's disorienting. And the other side of it, I think, is he reminded me a bit like a poet that got poo-pooed in the 70s was Rod McEwen. He's taking you down a very emotional path, using this imagery. One of the poems that I read was from the Nine Horses book, Return of the Key, and he references things so that you know exactly where he is and where he's going and where you end up. You're in his mind. And I think those are the engaging things about him. The other thing is, I think for everybody in maybe this room, is we're all a bit literary snobs, and his references to other literary fans. William Carlos Williams, one of my favorites. So as soon as he put that in there, that was on my list. So there were lots of things from a poet standpoint, the reading, the emotion, the accessibility, that made me think, hey, this is the kind of person that could get other people to read poetry, not just us who maybe studied it in college and love it and kind of our closet poets. So that's how I felt. And I'm going to read more of him after I read this.
Thank you so much, Barb. Brava. Is there, before we get to the closeout, I just wanted to see, are there any more hands or comments that maybe we'll share, and then I'll turn it over to Karen and Ryan. I'm pleased with our first ever venture here. We'll fine tune, and we'll definitely take your constructive criticism. But I love doing this, and I love Case Western Reserve because we try new things and we do new things, and we're all about this sort of interaction and this dynamic. Okay, well then, Karen and Ryan, how about you guys? I think there's another poem coming, or you guys are going to close us out, and I'm back to mute land. All right, bye.
Okay, so the lanyard. I really want to share this one because this is my husband's favorite poem, and he never had a favorite poem before hearing this poem, and that's why Billy Collins became his favorite poet, because of the lanyard. To hear that Billy Collins was an only child, my husband was also an only child, a boy, and we raised two sons. So to him, this poem just seems so true. The lanyard. The other day, as I was ricocheting slowly off the pale blue walls of this room, bouncing from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one more suddenly into the past, a past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift from my mother. I'd never seen anyone use a lanyard or wear one, if that's what you did with them. But that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breast, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in many a sick room, lifted teaspoons of medicine to my lips, set cold face cloths on my forehead, and then led me out into the airy light, and taught me to walk and swim, and I, in turn, presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said, and here's clothing and a good education. Here's your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones, and teeth, and two clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here I wish to say to her now is a smaller gift, not the archaic truth that you could never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the 2-ton lanyard from my hands, I was sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even.
That's great.
Do you have?
Yeah, I think this is a wonderful poem. And I think it can be tricky to do a narrative poem, but this is a narrative poem that really, really works. And especially the dynamic near the end, of course, as it starts to dawn on us the kind of epiphany that has taken place, right? My favorite moment in the poem, and then maybe you can give us your favorite moment, Karen, is: here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones, and teeth, and two clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. Here we have, no pun intended, a moment of solipsis, which is where here is being used kind of in two different ways. On the one hand, it's I give you, right? Here I give you this body, everything that you are, but also just here in front of me, just as I've given you all this, you're also the gift back to me. And so the way that he's able to do that soleptic moment to mean both in a giving way and a receiving way is, I think, really, really just brilliant. You know, what do you think? What's your favorite moment?
Well, I just want to say a couple of things from our brilliant comments earlier, how we love about Billy Collins, no cookie nibbled by a French novelist. Of course, you know those Madeleines, you're thinking about those cookies. And also, how does he come up with these things to write about? And he's talking about, like, flipping through the dictionary. I mean, there's one where he throws a dart at a dictionary. There's, he says poets spend a lot of time looking out the window. That's their job. So we also see where he comes from. But I think the thing that touches me is not that he's saying that he's not saying you can never, that it's not the truth that you can never repay your mother, but what he's really giving her is the admission that he thought he could, he thought he had. And I love that. I love the admission.
Yeah, it's great. And at the same time, it's he's kind of questioning again what poetry is able to do, right? And here I wish to say to her now is a smaller gift, not the worn truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission, etc., right? This poem literally serves as this admission, right? So poetic making, just like we saw, the creation of poetry might not be the most valuable thing. Just like squeezing all the meaning out of a poem might not be the most valuable thing. And so there's a mystery to that of what does poetry give us? It seems to give us a lot. Billy Collins thinks it gives us a lot. But it's about, it gets us somewhere, right? Just like this poem is able to hopefully get somewhere in re-understanding relationships and in gratefulness and all sorts of things that are essential to who we are.
Hey, Karen and Ryan, we actually have a comment that I think just ties into exactly what you're saying too, and it's from Jane Davis, and now I'm going to read it. It says, one of the strengths of the poem is that lanyards hold things together and are used to keep what you don't want to lose, an example of deeper meanings in an outwardly straightforward poem. I think that's very profound. Thank you, Jane, for sharing that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I hadn't even thought about that.
No, me either.
This is a great, we could even see this as a kind of tradition in American poetry of when do things from the real world almost take on a symbolic meaning? Right? Melville does this with whaling, right? And all the detail of the world of whaling. When do things almost take on a spiritual aspect? There's something to that in Billy Collins with his use of the everyday accessible things around us that take on these greater significances.
Any more comments?
So, Karen, would you like to say farewell? We've definitely exceeded. We wondered if we'd go 5 minutes or if we'd go an hour, and I think we went over a half hour, so we feel really good about that. Glenn North, a current Black poet, is worth trying too. Thank you, Susan, for sharing that. Appreciate that. But I'm going to turn it over to Karen and Ryan to sign us off. How about that?
Oh, do you know what? I think does not, if, would love for one of you to do it, but I'm going to let Ryan. Could you, well, December 3rd, let me just say that part. December 3rd, Billy Collins. I think we all appreciate Billy Collins, and I hope we will see you all either in person or Zooming the Think Forum on December 3rd. And also look online and see, make sure you get the other Think Forums on your calendar.
Yeah, that'll be a great event. Thank you so much to Karen for inviting me into your home, and for the Alumni Association for having me do this. This has been wonderful, and it's been nice seeing some of our alumni and talking with all of you about poetry.
And thank you all for your wonderful comments. It was great.
Yes, this was awesome.